3PNR with Adam R. Welcome to 3PNR. I'm your host, Adam, and joining me is Detective Jason White and Leslie Giglieari. How you guys doing?
Good.
Really good.
So, up front, tonight's episode, it's going to be based on the Zodiac killer. We'll talk about other things, obviously, and then future ideas. To give people a little context, so that when they're listening, Jason White is an active homicide detective. So he has, cases and a job to report to every day, on top of which he teaches. His schedule is slammed. So, Jason, if you want to expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I love talking about murder, and we've had a little bit of a break in the action, in part probably because of the summertime. And I know Adam had a lot of stuff going on, and that's somewhat of a busy time of the year for us as well. So between all of our schedules, that's kind of one of the reasons that we've kind of delayed up to this point. We've had a blast so far, and I think this has been a ton of fun. But there are times when scheduling things where I've had to catch a murder or something like that, where I haven't been able to be available, etc. I will tell you this, just for the listeners, because I've noticed, we read all of your comments and stuff, and I love to read the feedback. And so far, it's been really, really fun to read. Some of it's been constructive, and for that also we appreciate that as well, because I mean that's part of it. But I have to remind the people that listen just briefly that we don't have. This is just us sitting around talking about really interesting cases to us that we feel would be an interesting topic to kind of revisit, so to speak, and to talk about kind of different things that are out there that may not have been used previously. So keep that in mind. We don't have the volumes that goes into these cases. There's guys that work these cases that I can promise you do not know all the inner workings of that specific case. And I'm talking about the leads of those cases. Okay. There's a tremendous amount of information, thousands upon thousands and several volumes of books that go into these cases, all of which, by the way, we are not privy to. So we are going off of stuff that's available to anybody else out there on the internet or whatever, documentaries, docuseries, etc. So that's kind of it. I just wanted to at least mention that I've read a couple of them, like, this guy doesn't know all there is to know about this case. Well, heck no, I don't know everything there is. I don't know everything there is to know about my cases. So
yeah, I mean, not everyone knows everything. Not even the people directly involved know everything, or else there wouldn't be a case. It'd be just a closed book.
Of course. So, but it is fun to revisit these cases, and I've had a really good time about it, and I've learned a lot actually on the way. So it's good. And
the idea of forming a panel is, at the end of the day, we're taking information and forming opinions based on what we learned, right? Otherwise, I would be making calls. I wouldn't be on a podcast. I'd be calling a detective, and then someone would be incarcerated. So
precisely.
So that being said, we're diving into this Zodiac case now. This is the one case, as grandiose as it is, as much coverage as it has, and all over the social media. There's still no definitive answer, other than there's a laundry list of suspects: Arthur Allen, Lawrence Kane, Richard Grgowski. There's a Gary Post I just learned about, and then on and on. And even that Lawrence Kane, they also know him as Lawrence K, as in Kaye. So far, he looks good, because a cabbie that had a close call with the Zodiac ID'd his picture and made a match by his voice. And then, the Arthur Kane, or the Lawrence Kane guy, he's also trained in military codes. I mean, but then some of the other guys on the list also have code training, a couple of them, they're former Navy. So here's the big question. We're going to open up with this. I'm looking at this. Jason, it's 1968. You get a phone call. You're hearing about this Zodiac killing. There's a couple in the car. They're shot to death. One guy, survives his death. Procedure for you, because this sounded to me a little bit sloppy, poorly handled, I should say.
Well, the world of homicide investigation in 1968 is not even remotely similar to the way it is today. Back then, you got to remember that they didn't have surveillance camera systems that they do today. They didn't have cell phone technology or cell phone towers that are everywhere. They didn't have the ability to test for DNA or things like that. As a matter of fact, they didn't even know that the packaging of evidence back then is completely different than it would be for today. If you were to take a glimpse back to 1968, I can promise you, if you were to look at crime scene photos, that you're going to see detectives walking around and handling things without even wearing gloves. I mean, that's just the way things went back then. So we've changed dramatically since. I mean, and I'm not saying that it's made our job. I'm not saying that it's not. Our jobs aren't complicated, because they're overly complicated. Everybody that we deal with nowadays, they know that we look at cell phones. They know that we look at social media. They know all the things that we can do. So that's kind of where we're starting, is that we're talking about a time here where they weren't going to be able to get DNA necessarily. What they would be able to get is they would be able to literally get a blood type, maybe,
right,
at the scene. And aside from that, they're not going to be able to get DNA. Now, I will mention one thing about DNA that I think is worth mentioning, is that the discovery of that actually happened about the turn of the century, 1900. So the physicians or scientists knew that actually existed, and that but they didn't really know how to utilize that until really kind of the 50s, where they started utilizing that for disease processes, things along that nature. And then it was first used in the 80s, and that was for a murder case. There was a guy in England that thought, why can't we use this for identification purposes in a murder trial? And that's what they used. And then, nowadays it's everybody that sits in a jury, they want to know, where's the DNA? And they are questioning, if we don't have DNA, then the guy must not have done it. It's kind of the CSI effect, so to speak. So that's kind of the difference of the time from back then. Furthermore, real quick, these detectives and stuff, there was a little bit of a different method that they would use to interview people, and probably not necessarily the best way. I mean, now that you have cameras everywhere, and we're even watched by cameras. We're one of the few occupations on the planet that, a matter of fact, it's the only one that I know of where you're actually watched. Everything you do is on videotape to some extent. And so cops may have had a little bit of a different technique of interviewing people back then than they do today. Right. There was just a different method to get to the truth or whatever. So I'm not saying that they would handle witnesses or victims like that, but maybe the potential suspect from time to time, they were a little bit more firm with than they are today, of course. So things are different. It's just a different world that we're living in, and that just kind of gives people and everybody knows that. Everybody that's listening to this, if you think that it's the same way back in '68 as it is today, then
you're kidding.
Then you've been living
yeah.
You've been living in a bubble. I mean, that's not possible.
This is demonstrated even in the O.J. Simpson case, which I covered with Norm Pardo. That was grossly mishandled, and that's 1994. Even as early as or as late as the 90s, attorneys were combating the DNA use. They were trying to have it thrown out. There was a lot of legislation behind it. It wasn't, the era that you're currently working in is where we have the strength. Like, I would imagine it's hard to be a serial killer today, right? Because it's
I'll tell you this. I can guarantee you that there is a motherload of serial killers out there that are sweating it, because now they have the ability literally to do forensic genealogy. And just to kind of give, I can't remember what I've talked about previously. You could literally take DNA from a scene, and if you have a good enough strand, you could actually send it to a company. The one that comes to mind is Snapshot Parabon DNA, and you could send it to them with a check for like $4,000 or $5,000. And they will send you back a picture of what the individual looks like at 25 years old from that DNA. Okay. And I'm going to tell you right now, the composite that you're going to get back is right on the money. I mean, it is spooky scary as to how close it looks like to the people. And if you want some proof of that, go to their website, and they've got plenty of examples on their website to show you that how close it is to the person that they've gotten the DNA from. Or the DNA is how close it is. They can tell eye color, hair color, facial characteristics, and it's at 25 years old. Now, if the perpetrator happened to be 35 or 45 when they committed the crime, then that's fine. You can actually pay more money for that option. And you don't know how old the guy was at the time.
Right.
We go off of what witnesses state. And then secondly, I just want to mention this. From that, then what they'll do is they'll do some forensic genealogy search on that. And then that's where, personally, I don't know this for a fact, but I have this belief that that's probably how they identified the killer up in Idaho, was off of basically doing some forensic genealogy off of DNA that they had recovered from the scene. When they did that, what they probably did is they tracked down that it's this line, and then they start seeing, well, who's in that family and who lives in that area based on that. And that's when they found that it was probably him. Then, of course, they find out that the car that guy drives, et cetera, et cetera. The most notable case with forensic genealogy that I'm aware of is the Golden State Killer, which he was a cop that was a serial killer and serial rapist in the Sacramento area. And that's just the one that really stands out. But that's where we're at in that world. And just to kind of mention, that's how far we've gotten. And with the O.J. Simpson case, you just didn't have that. That was we've went leaps and bounds since that case.
Yeah. And, not for nothing, in that particular case, if you ever get around to listening to the episode I did with Norm Pardo, there was a lot of personal gain, personal interest in both law enforcement and people on the opposite side. I mean, there was a lot of nonsense involved with that. And, that's the one case in a courtroom where they were calling forensics into question pretty often. Anywhere from the scene, there was blood tracks that were from police shoes, I suppose. Crazy. So today's different. Imagine, Jason, maybe one day, I don't know. Like, you remember the movie Minority Report?
I haven't seen that.
It's with Tom Cruise. It's basically to have a machine that could analyze the public and predict crime. They could stop it before it happens somehow. Ultimately in the movie, they find flaws in it. But the point is they were making arrests before a crime. When you look at today's technology and AI, I don't know. In the next decade, something along those lines might come about. It's creepy. It is creepy. Is this with the Zodiac case? When we have the technology to revisit the past, and if we could do that, where you kind of like that movie Deja Vu, where you can look into this window of the past, maybe that could be feasible. But even then, I think they'll be surprised. I think the Zodiac, personally, I think there was more than one person. I think there was an opportunist who saw this in the news, saw the ciphers, and so is the only way I could explain that only some of the ciphers could be unscrambled and some of them were just nonsensical. It was just somebody utilizing an opportunity. Leslie, what did you get from what you learned in Zodiac? What do you think? What is your opinion?
Well, in reference to the DNA, I was pleased to know that even back in the late 60s, when they were utilizing DNA like we can now, that they were still making an attempt to preserve evidence so that later on, like they have done in the Zodiac case, they were able to take some of those pieces of evidence and get DNA from them. So I thought that was showing some foresight on their part to try to, at least maintain somewhat of a integrity to those important cases, so it could be retrieved. But gosh, like you said, there's so much to it. I remember when it was first in the paper, and what caught my interest was with Paul Stein, and when he was murdered in his taxi, and hadn't heard about the couples that had been attacked at that point. At least I hadn't. And the crimes themselves seemed so random in terms of the victims, the time of day, the method of attack in different jurisdictions. To try to piece all that together is pretty formidable. And then to try to get different jurisdictions to cooperate with information is a challenge too. For some, some of those reasons are understandable, them wanting to keep their information in-house, but it makes it difficult to approach maybe a suspect that's out there that's wandering around in different jurisdictions. And I had watched different videos about this. And then all of a sudden pops up a murder down in Riverside, California. So it's just one surprise after another, one complication after another. And then you throw the ciphers in there, and gosh, it's just a lot.
So, I mean, just by what you said out loud, put in your mind this. It sounds planned, right? This is the kills are not happening in the same jurisdictions. The ciphers are coming out. Some of the ciphers seem like they could be decoded. Other ones seem just nonsense. Some of the verbiage sent to the newspapers. This individual not only had a plan, but he was enjoying himself. And Jason could tell you, copycats, there's no shortage. There's none. Opportunists are even worse, because now you got a guy who's killing, and then there's even the idea, and I've read this on a Reddit page, where he was working in concert with others. This was a group effort, which terrifies me to hear that. But there's these weird realities we have to live in, right? But for you, I guess I'll ask this. You have a creative mind. You're a writer, right? If you were going to write a fiction story on this, what would the angle be? Like, how would you put it?
I'm not sure how to take all those different components and put it in one. It seems to me that it could very easily be more than one killer out there capitalizing on the methods of someone else. The Zodiac himself, who insisted initially on being publicized and got what he wanted, got the attention he wanted, was no doubt thriving on terrorizing the community. And the more people that knew that he was out there, the more he could terrorize the public and confound the law enforcement officers that were out there trying to figure out who he was. So I don't know, just and it was very confusing about the ciphers, because to me they are a big puzzle. And I don't know, maybe Jason has a view about the judgment call in publicizing those articles. I don't know if there'd be a different view on it now than there was at that time, when the criminal insists on having something put on the paper. Is that
yeah, Jason, what do you think here? Let's ask this. Are these ciphers a distraction, or are they just really that good?
Well, I think that in some instances they're really that good, because there have been 2 or 3 of these things that have actually been broke. So, but it took a tremendous amount to get to a point where they've been able to crack them. So I have no doubt in my mind they've had some of the world renowned code crackers try to break these things, and it's taken years and decades to get to a point where they were able to decipher them. So I completely agree with you that I think that there's a claim that maybe he's involved in, I think the number is, 37 homicides or somewhere close to that?
37.
Now, I will say this. I don't think that he's responsible for all of them. I think that there's probably different people that are responsible for various murders, or there's those that they think that he may be responsible for. They don't have 37 of these that are linked via DNA, or they might have some of them that have links such as that, but they don't. There's no doubt in my mind there's going to be different killers to some extent here. Okay. The number one thing is that. The other thing is that I think that what you run into with challenges with a killing type person such as this, and I'm certainly not somebody that I would consider an expert when it comes to serial killers. But here's the thing. Murder, what makes these complicated is if the killer doesn't have a connection to the victim. And the other thing that I would say, and you said something about this, Adam, that there's been speculation that maybe he operated with other people. I would find that very, very hard to believe, just because people cannot keep their mouths shut.
Right.
And when there's some of the most successful serial killers out there, and the one that comes to mind is Pee Wee Gaskins, who a lot of people don't even know who that is. And that's a guy that he even wrote a book about his killing escapades, and he talks about how stupid he was by letting somebody else know something about one of the murders.
Right.
you can, when people do stuff like this and they don't have a connection with somebody, then, and especially when we talk about the time frame when this happens back in 1968 with no video cameras, no cell phone towers, we're tracked everywhere now. Really, there's a footprint of us, an electronic footprint almost everywhere. So, but you have to find where you have to find that. That's what makes this job interesting and difficult. But I don't think that the ciphers, to answer your question in a short way, I don't think they were all prepared by him. No, I don't. But that would be something I would be interested to know from the handwriting experts. Well, I think that they did find some, that they did a lot of handwriting work on a lot of these possible suspects. They had hundreds of suspects in this particular case. Mm-hmm. There's probably a handful of like 5 or 6 of these guys that really, really stand up as really good-looking suspects on this particular case. I know that there was a report recently that one of them is that you can go on the internet right now, and it says that they've solved the Zodiac killing.
Yeah, I saw that. But they're pointing at at this Lawrence K or / Kane.
Right.
You have a couple of guys. One is a really big name. You have David Orenchek. He's a cipher guy. You have Faisal Zakawi. This is a guy who writes programming, and he wrote programming specifically for the one cipher where it says, "Here's my name," and so on and so forth. And in one of the AI ciphers, or AI decoding it, something to the nature of, "I hope you're having a fun trying to catch me." And then it's quoted as him saying, or as anyway, alleged him saying, because this is a decode, we're not sure, but it says he has slaves in paradise for his next life in paradise. Slaves, like, so, ritualistic nonsense, like he's taking lives to walk him to the next life. It's as far, and I'm no handwriting expert, but I did take a lot of still pictures of the ciphers, and a lot of the characters, they're similar. You would want to say beyond a shadow of a doubt the same guy wrote them, except for one of them. I did take notice, and I didn't hear him say it in the show, but I did take notice in the O's and the upside down T's and the underscores were vastly different, in my opinion. So I think you're right. I don't think that, and I'm going to agree with you this. I don't think there was a group of people working together. I don't think that. I personally think one guy was the Zodiac, as he claimed to media, and just started taking credit for other murders in order to put the police into like this circle of confusion, especially when there's one happening far away from where he typically would do this, right? So it's in that, and to Jason's credit, what he's saying, like in 1968, no phones, no internet, no cameras, it's a nightmare. It's 100% a nightmare. This guy's intimidating the newspaper people, the police. It's bizarre. The whole case. Well,
let me mention one other thing, because you bring up an interesting point that one of them was kind of out of the area. Serial killers are we're all people are creatures of habit. Okay. We like to stay around in the areas that we're familiar with, and we feel like we're secure in those areas. We generally drive the same way to work every day. That's just the way we operate. And serial killers are the same way to an extent. I mean, they're not gonna do their dirty deeds in areas that they're not familiar with, because they don't want to get caught up short or whatever.
Right.
This is kind of the same type of a deal. BTK, if you look at his case map and the areas that he killed, it's for the most part, all of that is pretty concentrated in an area that he was very, very familiar and very comfortable in those particular areas.
Right.
He's kind of an interesting guy too, because BTK is similar to the Zodiac in one respect, and that was that they wanted that attention.
Right.
They needed that attention, and that's really what ultimately got BTK caught. But
and both of them coined their own name.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So
it
is a fascinating case, though. It really is.
That guy, he scares me. That guy really did scare me. The BTK guy. He was a family guy with a job, who tried to work for the police. I don't know the circumstances why he didn't get the job, but ultimately became a park ranger, part of community reach out, part of community organizations. And
right. Like an animal control officer wanting to be a police officer. And he tried to become a police officer as well. So,
yeah. And he's just another guy in the neighborhood. Like that.
Yeah. When you look at him, you would never suspect him ever.
Right. Exactly. Like he doesn't look like the monster he's depicted as. Like Leslie, her and I had an episode, which I'm going to be releasing this week some point. We talked about Ed Kemper. Now, this guy, he's incredibly intelligent. He was very aware of not going back to the scene of the crime, only because he's like 6'9". He's a huge dude. He knew that he would stand out in the eyes of people as like, well, it doesn't matter where that guy goes. He's going to stand out. For him to take the time and really think about how he's going to behave, what he's going to do, people like that should scare you. But I got to tell you, man, the BTK guy, he could be living next door to you and you would never guess. You'd never have a shot. You'd never even see it coming. That troubled me. And when Leslie's episode comes out with the Ed Kemper, it was personal for her. It's scary because, she's receiving calls and here's this guy who could probably manhandle stronger men, let alone the women he was targeting, and really had no MO. The women weren't like of the same, they didn't have like, there wasn't like a brunette being targeted or a blonde. It was just women, period. Maybe in a certain age gap. I'm not even certain of that, So
I'll tell you what would be really interesting for any of your listeners, if you really wanted to have if you really want to dive in, the first homework assignment for you for the Zodiac killing case, if this is something that really fascinates you, is watch Dirty Harry with Clint Eastwood. It's the very first movie in the series that he did with all those Dirty Harry movies. Mm-hmm. And that movie is based on the Zodiac killer.
Oh, wow.
The whole movie is I don't know if you didn't know that movie came out in 1971. It's homicide detective in San Francisco, and he's making demands that he wants something published in the newspaper, that he's going to kill all these people if you don't. I'm going to take a school bus. That whole movie is based on the Zodiac killer. And it's perfect because it's right around that time when the Zodiac killer was on the minds of everybody in the Bay Area in San Francisco. So interesting that they did that with all the. I had no doubt the Zodiac killer watched that movie. He knew that movie is about him.
He's 100% a narcissist. He watched the movie.
Absolutely, and he knows that it's about him because when you watch it, and I'm taking it, Adam, you didn't even know that.
No, I had no idea.
It's about that case. It's 100% about that case. So, and that's a great roadmap as to what was going on around that time frame, because like I said, that movie came out in 1971, so the same techniques of how to investigate cases was the same in 1968 as it was in 71, and you get a glimpse as to what was available to them and what they could actually do at that time.
I'm gonna watch that movie
really
now.
Holds up.
I gotta watch that movie. I have to. I have no choice. That's like you said. That's a time capsule into procedure. Then that's amazing. Jason, let me ask you: Have you ever been around a serial killer, or have you encountered one of these guys?
We had 2 serial killers in the city of Tulsa last year in 2022. I can tell you that, and both of them got caught. I can tell you that with respect to those particular type of serial killers, they're not the type of serial killers that I think people visualize. I think most people visualize the Ted Bundy type, sexual, sadistic type killers. We're not talking about those type. We're just talking about guys that's almost like, well, there's 2 of them that I mentioned there, and I'm dealing kind of with one on my own that's more of the gangster variety serial killer. That is a guy that was he's just a shooter. I mean, he's a shooter in the gang world,
right? And
this guy would kill you on sight. Okay, but so I've had experience. A little bit of experience, not a whole lot, but I am dealing with one right now where I know that this guy's probably good for multiple murders, and it's just we're trying to get to the bottom of some of them. But no, it just doesn't happen a whole lot. I can tell you in the city of Tulsa that I'm aware of, I know that they identified somebody from the 70s that was a truck driver passing through that they think, or I know that guy was a serial killer, and then they believe one of the victims was here in this area, etc. But it's not something that fortunately, we haven't had a lot of experience in dealing with that. But of course, I'm certainly fascinated with it. I mean, it's interesting because We've had spree killers and stuff, of course, and those that the mass shooters. We had one of those last year as well. We kind of got hit with all what you could, if you could imagine it. We had it in 2022. So we did have a mass shooting. As a matter of fact, we had the first mass shooting after Uvalde. It was the very first one in the country, following Uvalde. So the eyes of the country were on us, believe me, after that situation. But no, we just had the two serial killers. But these weren't like your sexual sadistic type killers. They were. They were
contractors.
I'm not going to say that they were clinically mentally ill, but there's something wrong.
Well, yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, even if you're a contract killer, you're getting paid to murder, you're still a psychopath at your core. Mm-hmm.
There's something wrong. Yeah,
there's no human being that, I don't care what money you're getting paid, that they go to bed after 13 people and they're going to bed. If you're going to bed A-okay after you've killed a number of people, it's probably safe to say you shouldn't be in society. Right. Here's a different perspective too. And when I spoke with Leslie the night after I'd spoken to her, it enlightened me, because I never spoke to someone who was vetted by a murderer, right? So Leslie, for you, this is a good perspective for probably even Jason here. In that period of time when you have Ed Kemper calling your house and he's calling other people in the neighborhood, not just what you're feeling, but what's the feeling of you and the neighborhood at that time in that era?
Well, you have to remember that we didn't know it was him that was calling.
Right.
So that was information that came to light. It was just a stranger calling. And I didn't have a lot of contact with the people that lived next door to us or the people on the other side of them. I think my mom talked to them a little bit more. I was a teenager and I was just kind of doing teenage stuff. And so the phone calls, how they affected me was just changed my life to kind of my naivety, I guess you would say, of the innocence of life. I mean, I knew things went on, but it became really personal really quick. And so I think, it was a method for him to terrorize everyone in the neighborhood. And I'm sure he got a lot of joy out of the things he said, and the reaction as a man with his IQ would certainly know what kind of reaction he was getting from the people he was calling.
Right. I mean, especially it has a profound effect on you, because you had an emotional response when we were talking. And it's only because at that time, when you revisit it, you realize who the person is. It's more terrifying when they're a stranger, because now it's a monster in the night. Mm-hmm. But when there's a face to that monster, and that monster's 6'9", and just so, how do you describe his disposition? He was just so stoic.
He was very matter of fact.
Yeah,
that's what I told the detective when he came out to take the report. I just knew when he called that he wasn't a kid or a person fooling around. He was. This is just what he was about, and it was chilling.
Yeah, I mean the psychology behind that, and we talked more in depth about Ed Kemper is, his background contributed a lot to it. Not mm-hmm. Even though he did, like we said, he got involved with hurting animals. That really wasn't his that wasn't demonstrated by him early on. His psychosis came from pain and some pretty serious shit his mom put him through. However, that doesn't excuse his actions. The point I make is, you have this area where the Zodiac's loose, and for a long period of time, this guy is terrorizing the news. He's terrorizing neighborhoods. So let me give you a memory I have. When I was a kid in Brooklyn, there was a guy who was, I guess, trying to abduct children in Brooklyn. And it's a little different than a small town, because in Brooklyn, I remember the adults hiding like bats and sticks. So if they saw the guy, because that guy was not going to go to jail if they found him, in that neighborhood in Brooklyn, if the parents caught you, you're death sentence automatically. But it's got to be different for people in smaller communities that, it's not as compact as a city, and there's this villain that's walking around doing these horrible things, and the psychology on the people's got to be, it's mortifying, and then like I give kudos to Jason, like to do his job. It's not easy to do Jason's job. It doesn't matter who you are. Eventually it takes a toll on you, or it takes a toll on you in a moment. I'd spoken to some other homicide detectives that don't come on the podcast, and what seems to be the common problem is when it involves children. It takes a really, really hard hit on detectives. Jason, children for you, that's got to be the hardest of them all, right?
Okay, let me give you an example of something that happened to me yesterday that has never happened to me in my career, and that I had to give a 6-year-old a death notification. Okay, about his mother. And you talk about rip your heart out.
Yeah.
And just absolutely one of the most miserable things I've ever had to do is to sit there on the floor with a 6-year-old and explain. And this is all the DHS workers, of course, were the ones that were the psychologists, all the people that are involved in the human resources area, right? And they don't do those. So they asked me to do it. And so I did in reference to their mother's death. And it's just, yeah, of course, when you're dealing with children, that was a little bit different because I'm dealing with a kid that's alive, and
right.
and this kid doesn't even really understand the concept of death, honestly. But when you have children that are dead, that takes it to a whole nother level, And quite frankly, I feel blessed in the city of Tulsa that we do handle some kid murders and deaths. That's going to be more of the variety of like a family annihilation or a murder suicide of the entire family.
Right.
We would handle those. Whereas we don't handle like baby deaths when somebody rolls over on the baby in the middle of the night and the parent is sleeping with the kid in bed, et cetera, where it might have been an accidental. We don't work those, thank heavens. We also don't work the ones where it's like a child abuse where the parent might have shaken the baby, kind of a thing. That's going to be more geared towards a child crisis unit. Where we come in, we're better suited to deal with people that are stabbed, shot, mutilated, just flat out cold-blooded murder type, not the abuse type. They're better suited for that. So fortunately, I don't have to deal with that on a regular basis. But what we have from time to time, and those are horrible. The couple of other points, and I don't want to jump around, but there was one thing that you'd mentioned. When you talk about Ed Kemper, just for the listeners to know, that's actually where the profiling unit from the FBI originated from. Ed Kemper was the number one guy, the first guy that John Douglas had actually went out and interviewed, probably with his colleagues, and they interviewed him, and that was the beginning, just historically, of where the profiling unit for the FBI started, and that's where it originated from, if I'm not mistaken.
No, you're right.
That's what happened.
There's actually a show that surrounds that.
Mindhunter.
Yes, Mindhunters.
Which is great, yeah.
It's a great show, and it also gives you an idea of how, behind we were then. We had no idea. Profiling in that era, it's like today is sophisticated in comparison to what they had to. Back then, it was like a crapshoot.
Well, and I still think it is too. I mean, listen, you'll hear about it when they get it right.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
There's a lot of speculation that goes into a profile. All right. So I'm not a profiler. I don't even know what it takes for them to become a profiler, honestly, but I've talked to them before, and I think that it's difficult. Okay. It's really difficult. The thing that you'd mentioned also, just real quick, that something just jumped into my mind was two things. You'd mentioned, I think it was Leslie that mentioned this, was the different jurisdictions and the lack of sharing of information. And it might have been you that mentioned that too, Adam. That stuff still goes on today. You would think that we would learn to better work together. And I don't understand what the situation, why we do this to ourselves, but we just don't want to let go of that information. I don't know if it's a human nature thing where you might have some police officers that don't want somebody else to get the credit for solving this complicated case. The same thing happened in the Night Stalker. The same thing happened in the Hillside Stranglers. The same thing happened in the Manson murders. I can tell you of cases right here in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where the lack of sharing of information is detrimental to a case. I mean, it happens all over the country. That's one thing that I wanted to mention. The other thing that you'd said that kind of gives you a time, like we're talking about a time here. When you talked about, and Leslie mentioned this, when Ed Kemper was calling your house and maybe he was heavy breathing or he was talking or doing whatever, Well, people made prank calls back then all the time. Right. I mean, this is before the days of *67 or *69 on your phone, where prank callers, and I'm talking all kinds of people, kids, they would call and they'd start heavy breathing. Why do they do that? They're trying to scare the person on the other end of the phone.
Right.
And that stuff happened a lot. I'm not going to say it happened all the time, but it was much more frequent where people would do that. And the Golden State Killer comes to mind as somebody that was doing that too, where he was calling his victims beforehand or terrorizing his neighbors by telling them he was going to kill them. Can you imagine getting a phone call in the middle believe me, I get these phone calls in the middle of the night where I've got somebody screaming and yelling and cussing at me. Believe me, that's happened at 3:00 in the morning. You have a moment there where you are terrified, even me, where I'm like, what in the world? Who is this crazy person? Imagine that happening with somebody getting these phone calls just like you did, Leslie. It's terror. It's frightening to the core. And for the Zodiac Killer, I mean, he was utilizing things like that to inflict, he's inflicting fear. That's what it is. It's like it's a form of terrorism, really. And that's what he was doing back then. And my dad actually, he remembers when the Zodiac Killer called into the radio station, because we lived in the Bay. I wasn't alive in '68. I was born in '70, but I started growing up in that area. And my dad remembers hearing him call into the radio station. I mean, as did many, many, many thousands of people that when he called in. And I don't even know for sure if they've even verified that that's actually him or not. I think it is, because he talks specifically about the taxi driver that you had said, because he'd actually cut a piece of the guy's clothing from an article of clothing, so they could prove that it was him. Exactly.
Yeah, he would make note of things that were not public knowledge too. The guy that called in.
Absolutely.
And
absolutely.
Like Ed Kemper, I firmly believe that he was making those calls in that area. I was telling Leslie this, is that he was gauging the level of fear in the voice, and that's how he's vetting his victims, right? Because fear is a control factor as well as in some cases a turn on, but majority of them they recognize as if more you could actually this is demonstrated in a lot of what is it, Stockholm syndrome, where they instill so much fear that it becomes a control, and then the victim themselves start finding themselves emotionally attached to this person, which hard to believe for me, but it happens. It's noted. So
right.
Let me ask you, Jason. You touched it earlier. That Night Stalker. For one, I saw an interview with him, and he's smiling, and he's got. I kid you, I'm not kidding when I say this. A group of fans outside. Fans.
Oh yeah.
I mean, women too. Women fans outside, like insanity. But looking in that guy's eyes when he's talking about the murders, it's just of him. Some people, it's just in them to be that person, and that should frighten humanity. I mean, I can't imagine what it would be like in that era, in an era where the communication was lacking, and even like you're saying, the compartmentalization of stuff and jurisdictions. At what point does does the FBI ever step in and say, look, this is, you're a little over your head here. We could pretty much cross borders. Why is that not happening when there's serial killings happening in multiple jurisdictions? Why isn't that not instead of, I get not wanting to cooperate. You want your information. You want to be the hero of that case. Maybe I don't know what it is, but why doesn't a larger body of agencies step up and say, look, let us handle this? Or does that happen?
Well, I think a lot of it, each case is going to be a different scenario as to what the reasons are that aren't going on. Probably in some instances, it might be a personal bias that somebody might have towards the FBI, or they just don't want their assistance. I can tell you that personally, the FBI provides a lot of really interesting resources. They've got deep pockets, okay,
right.
And they have the ability to be able to do a lot of stuff that your ordinary police department can't do with respect to phone data, maybe, or just lab testing, et cetera. That's one of the things that jumps out to me, that the FBI would work wonders here. I don't know what the situation is. I don't know. A lot of it could be just simply because they have this adversarial relationship from one department to the next in some jurisdictions. Fortunately, I don't deal with that much here. For the most part, I know detectives from other communities that are adjacent to Tulsa, and in those, when they get a murder, especially in the smaller jurisdictions, I've gotten many phone calls from these guys that are like, what do you think about this case, and what would you recommend? And they're looking for assistance from just us, because we're the big murder city in the surrounding areas. We're the ones that deal with most of them, and then they might get one or two a year, or even it might be many years before a local agency gets one. And they're smart by actually calling an agency like us where we deal with it all the time. But I don't know. I think that's in part that now the FBI. I don't know what listen, I've never ran into it. We're a big city, so we don't rely upon the FBI to necessarily jump in on a case. They're not going to take it over from us. We're pretty capable of handling what we need to handle. Now, of course, if it was an act of terrorism, I'm sure that there could be something that they could come in and try to take something over or whatever. But for the most part, we don't deal with them on that level, so I don't really have the answer for that. But I will tell you, let's think about just briefly this case. What are they doing with this case now? Okay, so in reference to this case right now, what would I do? I would reopen every one of these cases. You would have to try to talk and have like a task force with other agencies. You all should sit in a room and have a list of things that you should do here. And everybody should be on board and willing to discuss and be criticized, or to really come up with a game plan that's kind of unified is
Right.
really what they need to do, like a task force.
Yeah, I mean, look,
And
I had Lenny DePaul on the show, and if you recall, in 2008, he was on a television show called Manhunters, Fugitive Task Force, and they basically said, we're going to form a task force of some of the greatest members of law enforcement from multiple states, multiple agencies, and we're going to go out and get these dangerous people. And the communication, the cooperation from jurisdiction to state, they broke records on fugitives apprehended. I mean, it was a great undertaking. So in the world of homicide, when you have these quote unquote serial killings and or cold cases, there should be like a task force, like maybe Jason White is now the head of the task force that oversees homicides that are both unsolved or ongoing or active state to state, and get the best of the best from these different states and agencies to do this. Because you believe it or not, even though right now, if there's a bunch of homicides and it happened in another jurisdiction, but similar ones you think the same guys on both, and there's that weird cooperation not happening. Did you know in the world of ufology, let's just talk about UFOs. If police are called to a scene for a UFO, I don't know if it's the same for you. I don't know if you ever got a call or heard of anyone getting it, but there is a department now that's solely in charge of that from the government. Can you imagine that? Like, human life has been taken and being taken. There's no department that spans nationwide for one entity to create a task force yet. When there's a UFO sighting, they have the department that works for the government that will come out and investigate. And I'm not talking MUFON. That's a private organization. For homicides, just my imagination, and maybe some television shows should knock on Jason White's door here. Like, hey, it worked for the Manhunters when we're actively tracking down these dangerous people. I want to say that, murderers are the top of that list, right?
Well, I have a couple of thoughts here. First of all, there's murders happening around the country all the time, right? So to figure out what cases would justify that sort of a task force, it would take seeing some trends. And I know now with computer analytical software, they can analyze data and maybe start to see some of those trends. And if something's happening here, it's similar over there. But I think that's relatively new to interconnect with that information. And since we're talking about the Zodiac, I think in particular, as we said at the beginning, there's so many variables that are not consistent. Just his jurisdiction of where he committed the crime, the method, the people that he decided he was going to murder. It would have been harder at that point to really link up the different cases. And then do we even know, looking back, like the case in Riverside that is now being attributed to the Zodiac, it was a single gal. And I think she was stabbed, as I recall. But at the time before that, maybe it was after, but the next murder that was attributed to him were couples twice, and then so I think it would be a little harder to establish a task force. You're talking the whole country, unless you see definite certainty, maybe DNA. I don't know, something that solidly links the cases together. And then I agree that a task force is a great idea in terms of you have more bodies on it and everyone working together for the same goal. But at the same time, your police departments are supposed to be able to manage crime in their area, and to kind of come in all of a sudden and say, well, you've had more than 3 and they look all similar, so we're coming in and we're going to help you. I don't know. How would a police department sort of feel about that, Jason?
Real quick, before you go there, let's eliminate the serial killer aspect, right? Let's rewind time to John Benet Ramsey. That department didn't have the capacity to solve a homicide, right? A high profile one like that. So in my imagination, there's this department, there's this little girl, she's been murdered. We suspect the father doesn't think he did it. There might be someone else. Why don't we, as this department, say, look, we're a little over our heads. Let's contact an agency or a task force and then you have the task force. You have a Jason White, several other detectives. They fly out there. They're made, they're given the information surrounding the case, and not take it over, but they're assisting at a higher caliber, right? Jason White is a vetted homicide detective. You know what I mean? He's worked a bunch. He's. So, but does that make sense to you, Jason? Like you would get, like the task force would get called in for this case that's considerably unsolvable. So they have you and your task force come out for assistance.
Well, first of all, I would love to have that kind of a job. How cool would that be, where you'd be able to go to various places in the country and be a part of some kind of a project like that? I think it would be fabulous. But I've never heard of anything like that going on, but it'd be a lot of fun.
I
just
think that's
to basically
needed.
Be a part of something like that. And the first thing that I think you would have to have is you'd have to have everybody check their egos at the door. And I don't know that that's necessarily possible.
Yeah.
You got the feds, you got state, you got local people that are going to be involved in these type of cases. And they all in and of themselves have their own, the municipal cops, that's their slice of the world. Mm-hmm. And they feel like they've got a pretty good grasp of everything that's going on there. I mean, it really starts out with what you should do. I've had cases like this, and I'll tell you I'll give you an example. So we had a case where a young lady was basically brutally raped, and she was thrown into a dumpster, brutally attacked, horrible, obviously raped, or at least sexually assaulted to some extent, and thrown into a dumpster. Well, the first thing that I thought we needed to do is we needed to consult with sex crimes. They call them the special victims unit in many places now, but it's sex crimes is what it is.
Right.
Why would you not consult with the subject matter experts that deal with that specific thing? If I'm dealing with an auto theft ring of homicide people, I'm going to call auto theft and have somebody from that team that's going to be a part of what we're talking about. Furthermore, I'm going to immediately talk to the people that patrol that area on a daily basis. The patrol officer that knows people in that community, that actually the community is more trustworthy. They're going to be more trustworthy and willing to speak to them than they would be the average just any old cop or somebody from the federal government that's going to come in here that says that we're here to help and you're going to tell me because I'm the FBI kind of a thing.
Right.
It's not going to work. So that's how we solve cases. It's not complicated. It's not building a rocket. It comes down to simple interaction with the public, basically talking to people and asking questions. And that comes even to the beat cop that works that area. Ask him, hey man, who do you know what do you know about what's going on over in this area? Have you ever seen a guy that looks like this? There's a murder case, and I can't remember which one it was. It was something that just happened recently that I saw on TV or something, where they actually enlisted the beat cop that worked that specific area and had him listen to the recording of this particular killer. And he's like, oh yeah, that's so-and-so.
Right. Yeah. Cause he knows the community. Yeah. I mean,
so the point of my story is if you have a group of cops and we're all sitting in a room as homicide detectives and we're all super smart because we're just the subject matter experts and we know everything,
right?
But yet we're not sharing some of these details with people that might be able to help us in that. But I wish I could remember the case because it just came into my mind. I just learned about this recently, where in that particular case, had they not shared this information with the simple beat cop, who is a super important person in the dynamic here, that they would have been scratching their head for decades. Maybe it could have been an unsolved case because they never took the time to ask the guy that works that area and deals with all the knuckleheads in that area.
I mean, I could see your point. You have a basketball team and everyone's Michael Jordan, right? Everyone wants that ball. I get it. But at some point, this task force, I'm imagining, that's funded by someone hired in your local agency to call in for what I would call specialized cases, whether it be a serial killer case that's just these guys are over their head or they're burnt out, or like the JonBenet Ramsey, which we're going to get that. By the way, that's going to be one of our future topics. I'm working on getting a former FBI agent who's looking at that case, and I'm working on getting him involved to get us on the panel with us with this. That case bothered me because the detective on working that case just didn't get homicides. He wasn't prepared. The rest of the agency, they seemed overwhelmed. They made a tremendous amount of mistakes. A lot of things were overlooked. Why in my mind, they're like, well, you know what? Let's call that task force to Jason White's on and get the team here. And ego or no ego, they're going to be able to take their experience and their expertise and loan it to this local agency. And just as you said, now, as you just said to me, like, oh, I remember this case where a beat cop was really important. Mm-hmm. That's that aha moment you would have for that agency and in that time. Well, what about this? Or it's that kind of thinking out of the box that you need to solve complex murders sometimes.
Yeah, and I don't know what the rules are in Colorado, but I can tell you from Oklahoma perspective, okay? Mm-hmm. So in Oklahoma, let's just hypothetically think that the JonBenet Ramsey case happened in Catoosa, Oklahoma, all right? So some small town in Oklahoma, let's say it happened there. Well, the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, they can't just go in there and take over a case with respect to that. The local agency actually has to request them to come in and work the case. I think it's I don't know why that ruling is. I don't know what the ins and outs of that are. I would assume to some extent that it's probably similar to that, or if not the same in Colorado. Otherwise, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation or the Colorado State Police, whichever one it is, they would have immediately jumped in on that case and started saying, not necessarily that you're going to take the case over, but you're going to be embedded with them and you're going to work alongside of them to assist them in any way that they need it. And it's almost like, well, this is the way it just needs to happen that way. In Boulder, Colorado, I think, if I remember correctly, with respect to that case, I think they only had 3 murders that year. This is not a town that is inundated with homicides. So especially one that is as complex as that case. I've been to that house, actually. I wanted to knock on the door, but I thought, nah, that's going to be too weird. but it would be a really interesting crime scene still to this day to literally walk through that house and get a feel for where the entry point was into the basement, and just the layout of the house would be fascinating just to walk through it. But I don't know that case is ever going to be solved unless there's real. I don't know, because I don't know what all the evidence is.
Here's the thing.
Really.
John Ramsey, the father, is spending hundreds of thousands of dollars of his own money to this day trying to figure it out. The man has not rested since then. He was crucified in the media like they always do.
Of course. Of course.
He was basically chased out of his neighborhood because, judgment of peers, etc. Yet he's still spending money. He's reaching out to the FBI. He got a show on Hulu. He pushed for this FBI agent to revisit it because there was a detective that was looking at the time, and he passed away during the investigation, and he drove some pretty good points about the way the entry is. There was a suspicious man in the area at that time. There was note of him. When we do our episode, we'll cover that in detail. But
I think that's great. That's a case that I'm really excited about talking about, actually. And that's a case that I think every homicide detective should have. If they are not aware one of the things that I kind of get frustrated a little bit with some of these homicide guys that come into the unit. It's like, hey, go home and watch all of the episodes of Cold Justice. You know, they talk about how to solve a cold case. It's great. And then you get these guys and you ask them, hey, did you watch any of those episodes? No, I haven't got around to it. I haven't done this. I haven't done that. That should be a required watch of anything on a case like that, to just kind of see, you can see the mistakes in some instances of what they made. Why are we repeating history? I mean, don't make those same mistakes, and,
right.
and really look at cases with an open mind. I think it's a fascinating case, actually. But
yeah, you got to take mental notes. Anything that, like when Leslie published her book, listen, she didn't publish it just based on small information. She did her due diligence. She read through everything. She covered as much information as possible to provide the story to the public.
Right.
Are there critics for her? Like she said, sure. She wasn't there to solve the case. She was there to provide the information given. You know, she's not trying to render her opinion and throw someone to the wolves like, I suspect this person. But she did her due diligence. And just like you said, when you're a homicide detective, yeah, you should definitely look at cases, definitely watch it, look for holes. When you play pool against another opponent, the one of the things I do, you watch their video, you see what they like and don't like. You know, that's why there'll never be a video of me, because I could study them. So anything you're gonna do, you have to study it through and through.
I think at the end of the day, people are going to, when this thing hits the internet on your YouTube page and stuff, people are going to go, well, wait a second. They didn't really even talk too much about the Zodiac. Really, they were talking about all these other things. Well, these other things are really the important thing. And that's
right.
kind of what you can talk about each one of these suspects, and you can dissect why they thought that this person might have been involved or this person was involved, et cetera, et cetera. But really, you're hearing what the reasons are that this investigation lagged, or they had complications. It is the lack of communication with one another.
Right.
It is the primitive crime scene that abilities that they had back in 1968. It's just they didn't have, like nowadays. You brought some other point up, is with respect to the Zodiac specifically. When you have a homicide that happens in another jurisdiction, well, back then, unless it was in the front page of the newspaper, it was in the San Francisco Chronicle, you may not even know about that case.
Right.
If you're working in San Francisco. Think about the one that happened down in Riverside or wherever it was down in Southern California. Those guys aren't even going to have a clue about that homicide because there is no internet. There is none of that. They would have to literally be somebody from that jurisdiction down there going, this is weird. And it was the same thing with the Night Stalker case, really, believe it or not. And I'm actually going to be hanging out with Gil Carrillo in a couple of weeks. And he was the lead for the Night Stalker case. And I'm super excited about sitting with him and meeting him in person and just kind of listening about the case. I'm going to learn a ton about that case. I'm super excited about talking to him. But he talks about that in that documentary on Netflix, where you'd have another agency just outside. Los Angeles has got a lot of other communities here and there, all around there, that the murder happens over here, and they might not even know anything about that case.
Right.
And so fortunately for us, they actually took it upon themselves to go to some of these jurisdictions and show up on some of these cases and so forth, and kind of try to help them, kind of a deal. So I don't know, but when people listen to this whole podcast, that's the one point I wanted to make, because there may be some criticism like, well, wait a second, they didn't talk about this guy.
I'll answer the criticism right now. At the end of the day, this is really a talk show with three people who are just having a conversation, and the people listening just get to eavesdrop. All right. This isn't like I'm going to provide some groundbreaking information. Covering these other cases and talk about other homicides, there are links, and it does tie in. We should have learned from the Zodiac. We should have learned from the JonBenet Ramsey. We should have learned from the OJ case. Let me tell you what I would watch. I would be subscribed and full-time watching a show with Jason White and the task force who are sent around the country to look at some homicides because local agencies are struggling. I would pay good money to see that for two reasons. One, I know that they're putting forth their best players for that game. Coach, give me the ball, right? Let them get in there, play the game, and really work to help these local people. This isn't trying to outshine a local agency. Let's remember, someone lost their life, and it's the obligation of the state to figure out who that is, and when they can't do it, it's time to call the all-stars, period. And then the other part is, for this whole thing, why we speak about everything the way we do, is because when it's that one person that's going to listen to a podcast, that's going to hear something. Then they're going to be like, well, you know what they didn't cover? And they're going to go do their research. And in their research, they might have an aha moment. They'll either put it into the comments or they'll contact the local agency. Like, you know what? This rings a bell for whatever reason. You never know. It's I read a statistic once. One of the strongest crime-solving individuals out there is the sleuth at home, the man or woman who's at home. They're interested in it, and they just have a mind for it. And something that might click in their mind, they'll come forth with it and say it. And it might be, maybe it's nonsense to the people in their circle, but that detective's like, well, it's a good idea. Let's have a look.
A perfect example of that is Don't F with Cats. That documentary about it's called Don't F with Cats.
Yeah, I haven't watched.
That's a perfect example of that, where the armchair quarterbacks at home, the amateur sleuths that are home, they're the reason for that case getting solved. I mean, I'm going to give them 100% credit on that deal. They're the reasons that case got solved. They're the reason, really, to tell you the truth. They're probably heroes in a sense that they saved lives, many lives, because God only knows how many other people that guy would have killed before. But they continue to put the pressure on, and that's people that watched that, and they started piecing things together and so forth. And that's really what this is about. This job is about that. It's about sitting down. And I'll tell you, I've said this before, Adam. Here in Tulsa, we've had an average of solving. I'll also give you an interesting statistic right now. In the city of Tulsa since 1963, we have had 2,781 homicides in the city in our city. 2,781. Out of those, we've solved 87% of them. Since 2016, it's roughly in the neighborhood of 95, 96% of our homicides we've solved. And one of the big reasons for it is teamwork makes the dream work.
Yep. Yeah.
That's what's up. Yeah, it's just working well as a team, communicating and having good relationships with the public. That's really what's up, because most of these cases are solved by people being comfortable with telling you what's up, or just having the interactions within a public, kind of a thing. So that's really the simple building blocks. And where you see cities that don't have a very high success rate, some of it's the demographics and some of it's just the historical relationships that they've had with, or distrust that they've had with the police departments and stuff. Here in Tulsa, this is the site of the worst race massacre in this country's history from 1921. Whereas we worked very hard with the public to try to have good communication with them. And if you're in departments where they have a low number, maybe it's, I hate to throw anybody under the bus, but let's just say Detroit is an example, or some of these other cities where you're going to have low numbers. A lot of that has to do with just, I think that there's that lack of building trust in the community and really getting out there and maybe just treating people right and talking to people right. I mean, it's really, my dad gave me, there's one thing that I'll mention and I'll get off, I'll quit running on here, but probably the best advice that my dad ever gave me in my whole career. And it's when I came on the police department, and he told me, he said, listen, there's two things of advice that he told me. The first one was, shut your mouth and listen to those that have been there longer than you, and be trainable, basically, is what he's talking about. And I think that that's one thing that we're kind of losing with the newer generations. The second thing is make sure that your badge, this is really the more important one, make sure that your badge is the same size it was the day they issued it to you, not 5 sizes too big.
Yeah.
It just means treating people right. And if you treat people right, you would be amazed at the amount of information that you get from people. And that's all it is. It's not difficult. You lose the cop persona. You're just a person that wants to do the right thing.
Right.
And when you go into it with interviewing these people and stuff, you'd be amazed at how much information you get. And it really goes down to that. And I think that, and trying not to get tunnel visioned, and I think that probably happened to the JonBenet Ramsey case to a large extent, where automatically everybody's just thinking, oh, it's got to be the parents, and we're not going to think of anything else that could possibly be. Same thing still, you're talking 1968 with the Zodiac. people weren't interested in training people back then. They didn't have any training. I mean, I don't even know if they had conferences throughout the country. They didn't have associations, which now we do, where we do have like-minded homicide detectives that get together and they teach about stuff. And we sit there and we go to these things. And I'll be teaching at one in San Antonio. So, we that's how we learn, is we learn from other people and we just didn't have that back then in 1968. And thank God that we're getting to a point now where we want to learn. And fortunately, most of the people that are in assignments like this in homicide, most are people that breathe homicide, that are obsessed with it to an extent. And that's what you want. You want people that are almost obsessive compulsive to a point about these type of cases, and they want to bring justice to the families. That's just what's up.
Yeah.
We lie awake at night on these cases from time to time. Believe me.
I agree with you. I saw a video of a deposition with a woman who was a lieutenant for 19 years. And in this deposition, she couldn't recite the Miranda rights by heart. That scared the shit out of me. I'm like, what? And they were asking her questions about law, and she couldn't even answer the question. She just flat didn't know. And then they went to the next guy, same thing. And then you have cops like you and other cops I've spoken to and cops I've watched on videos where they know things inside out. There's this thing called dedication, and if you're going to do something, you got to do it at the highest level. Because if you don't, you're just cruising. You have no ambition, so you're not really going to make a contribution to the team you're a part of, to the community. You got to really want to step up and do great. Otherwise, if you're just coasting, do you know who should never coast? Anyone that works in the medical profession. You should not coast. If you're in that profession and you're coasting, you should quit, because lives are at stake. Health is at stake. Yeah. You got to do it at the highest level. And, some people are underappreciated. They're underpaid. I get that. But if you didn't have passion for what you're doing in the beginning, then the pay shouldn't have been a question to start with. Right. Like Leslie, when she does her book, she takes pride in what she does. And when she does her research, she takes pride in it. It's a tough situation, especially in cities like Chicago. It's a war zone. And
I'll tell you something, Adam. You're hitting on something that's really interesting to me. So I don't mention it very often, but that's one of the advantages of the first 48. Honestly, I have felt that we have been tremendously blessed to be a part of something like that. And to give you an example, a super quick example of what I'm talking about. We had a white family that came up there, and they came up to our waiting room, and there was a guy that was in his 50s, his wife, and you could tell these people had lived a hard life. I mean, honestly, and they bring their 18-year-old daughter up there. And of course, one of my colleagues says, "Hey, they're talking about something. It sounds like it could be a murder. I don't know. Since you're up, you need to go talk to them." So I go out there, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, it's great to meet you," which we get that a lot in the community. It's kind of a cool thing.
Right.
Most people hate the police, but in fact, they kind of almost feel like they know us because they see us on TV. In some communities, they watch us all the time. And so this guy goes, "Listen, I'm going to tell you something. I spent over half of my life in prison, and I was raised to hate the cops, but I love you guys. And I brought my daughter up here because my daughter witnessed a murder yesterday, and she's going to tell you all about it. It didn't happen in Tulsa, but I brought her to you guys because I trust you guys."
Yep.
That is the value of something. Now, so what the moral of that is that one of the benefits of it, and a lot of people might go, "Well, why in the world would you want to have a show about murder in that community, et cetera, et cetera?" I mean, as part of your travel brochure, so to speak. Well, people get to see that we treat people right. And we really do. I mean, we have moments with these families that I'm tearing up, at sometimes when I'm telling them what in the world happened, and you build relationships with these people. So it's kind of the benefits. And I think that's one of the things that's really powerful about a show like that is people get to see really the passion that exists of what we do to bring peace to these families and the extents that we're willing to go to make that happen at personal sacrifice that is far beyond anything that people realize, really. So I don't know. I think that I am honored to be all of the homicide guys. We are honored to be in a position like this of such responsibility. And I think that we should never stop searching for justice on these cold cases. And literally 1968, just out of coincidence, 1968 is the oldest case that we have in our cold case room. that dates. We don't have anything from 1967. I couldn't tell you one murder that happened in 1967 that's unsolved. And so, but that's the year that we had. That's when you start having quality control and accountability of where these cases are. Where are they? Before that, there may not have been any quality control. Some of those case books literally might have ended up in somebody's garage, and God only knows, it might have ended up in a dump somewhere because the guy had case books in his garage. He dies, and then the family just throws it away. I mean, and those cases are gone forever. We don't have those things going on today. And also remember that when you're talking about cases from 1968, I've ran into this relatively recently. When I say recently, probably 7 or 8 years ago, where I started looking at a 1978 case because of a case that I was working. And in that particular case, those case reports are typewritten from a typewriter.
Right.
I know some people might not know what that is, but let me tell you something. Those letters off of that typewriter, those fall off of the pages after many, many decades. So I would say that probably 25% of that case, I couldn't even read it because it's so faded and the stuff is gone. So we have to work towards preservation of older cases, digitizing interviews, and because these CDs, there's a shelf life on those too, as there is on VHS tapes and cassette tapes.
Right.
And think about floppy disk for an example. There's a whole era that we have floppy disk, and if you don't have a reader, then how the heck are you going to look at stuff?
Not to mention
all of these things that we have to keep.
Yeah, they corrode. Floppy disk corrode.
Yes.
Yeah. They could be in an environment where there's a little bit of moisture, no corrode. You know,
think about all these cases that are sitting in case rooms across the country, across the world, really, that are sitting in rooms that hasn't even dawned on somebody in some of these cities, maybe. And so, you know, that takes a tremendous amount of work by any one individual to sit down and start prioritizing this to make that happen. And I'll tell you something, in my experience, to some extent, there's not a whole lot of priority on cold cases, really, unless that family is continually calling to get updates on that particular case.
Well, there's a way to change that, Jason. You know, we could, if you want, you could speak to some people in your department, and we could arrange it so every so often we have a podcast that's specified towards a cold case, especially one where there's no, you know, relatives. From 68, I don't think that sharing information over a podcast is going to damage the ability to, you know, it might even help. You never know. Someone might listen to podcasts, hear one little thing, might turn it around. You never know.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'm big on sharing information on some of those old cases and getting in front of the media and doing things like that. I will tell you, for the people that are at home that are sitting there, they're going to listen. If they're listening to this podcast and they're still to this point on the podcast where they're listening to right now, then you're going to get a really cool piece of information. And this is what's coming your way. If you really are one of those people that is just fascinated by murder and you want to just read up on stuff and you want to just kind of sit back and research stuff, go to the Iowa Cold Case website. This site is amazing. And I've been speaking for years on this to where I would like to model the Tulsa Police Departments and the state of Oklahoma's, for that matter, to look just like Iowa's. It's fantastic, and it makes people want to research cases. And the way they have it laid out is just phenomenal. And it's super user friendly. I could spend hours, if not days, on this thing, and it's in a state that I don't even live in.
Yeah, you just did to me, right?
I hope I got you,
you got
to the
me.
point where you're going to do it. You're going to check it out because it's fantastic.
It's already up on the other computer screen.
Good. So it's great. And when you go through that and you scroll through those pages, and the same thing is, here's the thing. A lot of people, I don't know what it is, but if it doesn't affect them personally, then they kind of just forget about it. And on these cold cases, there are people that honestly, they might even think that these cases have been solved. Literally. Right. They're like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that case actually wasn't even solved. And in some instances, it's just merely going back and just re-interviewing people. I mean, we just ran into this on a case literally this week. And it's one of those things, just re-interviewing somebody, you'd be surprised at what you might learn after a few years of this case sitting cold. So,
yeah,
but
you know
here's
what?
The problem.
There's a couple things here. Well, let's get back to the first 48. The message conveyed for the first 48, to answer your question, why people have trust. Why would they bring a case to someone that's out of their jurisdiction? You built a relationship with someone via TV. The message is conveyed from that show is that in my town, we are doing it the highest caliber. We're going to work hard to solve this. So it's conveying a message to potential criminals. If you are going to commit an act out here, there's a strong possibility we're going to get you. It's also conveying a message to the public. Your community is safer because you have these type of people that are doing it at the highest level here. So that if you had more public outreach with law enforcement state to state, I've said this in a lot of other podcasts, and you know who's really responsible is the community figureheads. Like there's a lot of these people in communities that they're very quick to point fingers at law enforcement in judgment instead of organizing like a meet and greet or like a monthly thing where, you know, there's food, there's music, and then the local law enforcement there, they're shaking hands, because then the communication starts getting established, the bonds start to be formed, and trust is established as well. That's needed. That's a needed thing. On top of which, cold case. So Leslie, you're big in true crime, right?
Yes.
So this website he's talking about, this Iowa State cold case. This is something you would read.
Iowa cold cases.
Yeah, I have the link here. I'll share it with Leslie.
Okay, great.
Like for you, what you do, you've obviously you've written a book about a homicide. The cold cases, they appeal to you, yeah?
Yes, because I think deep down, most people would say they would like to see justice for the victim and the bad guy caught. So I think we all would like to see those cold cases resolved.
Yeah. So, I mean, imagine for you, is there a cold case for you, Leslie, that stands out that you would like to see resolve on?
Oh, gosh, I really haven't been, I haven't gone into that as far as seeing what cases are out there. I know there are quite a few amateur sleuths out there that have gotten their PI license and are interested. I think that came with some of the series that we've watched about crimes, and you know, it's drawn interest into people that they've actively gone out and tried to see if they can find something out. I think that's pretty cool. But me personally, no, when I wrote that book that I did, it was a 5-year venture and I didn't have time for anything else. But I am very interested in learning about the JonBenet Ramsey case. I remember when it happened, but I really don't know much about it.
I think what we should do when we do the JonBenet Ramsey case, because Jason brings a valid point. There's a lot of cases that they're not prioritized because they're not as, high profile like JonBenet. This is a little girl, beautiful little girl. She was a pageant queen. There's a lot of cases that these people, they have really no family speaking out for them. It didn't really make the news. They deserve some kind of light. So perhaps we should dedicate a little time to, in the show, we'll talk about JonBenet or whatever case we speak of. And towards the tail end, we should cover a couple of cold cases and, bring it to public notice.
I have noticed on the LinkedIn social media site that there are people that are using that site to sort of spearhead a interest in maybe a loved one or a friend that never got justice, and trying to make those connections within the law enforcement field, or just reaching out to the social media community to try to get help. I think it's great. I would love to know more about it. May I say, kind of off the subject, but I had a question for you, Adam, about the Zodiac case. When I was looking at it, there was a series, just 5 segments, and they were talking about this team that they had put together a bunch of coders that had actually programmed an AI computer. Did you happen to see that?
I did. The problem with AI, as of right now, it's still being the code and programming is still written by a human to look for specific things, as opposed to it being an AI just being exposed to some data and see what it gets from it, right? The AI is trained to understand that we're looking at this specific topic. We have these specific details that we know. So AI is in a hyper focus on that, as opposed to it taking the time to, and I don't know a lot about AI. I just know what I ask of people that know about AI.
Well, there were a couple things. I watched 4 of those episodes, 4 out of 5, and they actually used the language that they had programmed this AI computer to think like a serial killer, which I found kind of creepy, actually. And then at the very end, when they were talking about how it had helped them and how it hadn't helped them, I found it interesting. Like you said, it is fairly new. And they were saying how there was when they came to a point in the cipher when it wasn't following the patterns that they thought it would normally be following in the cipher. The computer couldn't think outside of the box, so to speak.
Right.
You know, it couldn't really say, oh, this is an exception. It didn't know how to handle that information. But I don't know. There was something a little disconcerting to me to hear them say they were teaching the computer how to think like a serial killer.
Yeah. And I'm sure in the future, we're going to have AI at a point where it analyzes data and you don't have to give it context. It will just take the data and render its opinion on what it's seeing. Till that time, it's hard because again, in these shows where they're using their supercomputers to dissect these ciphers, and even the quote I had earlier about it saying about slaves and whatever, that's AI at work. It's unclear to me how it would come to that conclusion. At the end of the day, it's still speculation. It's not, you can't take it to court. I really stand firmly in the phrase, can I take this to court? Because if not, it's just hearsay. It makes for fun television. You know, that's the problem with people. And there's a lot of people out there that because it was on a television show, they take that information as fact. And then you have these tribal divides of people and that's where you could damage a case, is that you're pointing the finger at this guy, Art, but it's predicated on something you saw on a television show that may or may not have its facts right, versus the hard work of detectives who put the boots on the ground and they found this information through whatever sources they utilize. And so now you have 2 tribes of people, and what ends up happening is you have a hung jury. You know, it makes it really tough. Before we close out, let's discuss this idea. Jason, Leslie, are you guys good with covering JonBenet?
Yes, I'm really interested.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it would be a fascinating case to touch upon for sure.
All right. And at the tail end of that, Jason, I won't say for certain now. We'll cover it over the course of time. But maybe like a couple of cold cases that you want to highlight that you would want to speak of. And, we'll educate ourselves to it. Completely up to you.
Yeah, I don't have any issues with that. I think that I would be interested in some cases that are, I'm sure we can come up with something that would be really interesting. Yes.
Okay, good. All right. So before I close out, I'm going to say good day, good evening, good night to whoever's listening. I'm going to speak to Jason and Leslie in post.
All right. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Thank you.